I have a number of photographs on the presentation. They're largely going to be of quite a poor quality because they all come from relatively recent photographs from occupied Mariupol, which again almost speaks directly to the topic we're discussing, which is going to be about how civilians get intelligence and information about what is happening in the occupied territories out and some of the problems there. But being an academic, I also want to go a little bit beyond that and to talk about how Ukraine's experience under occupation has revealed how decentralized civilian intelligence has reshaped, or perhaps forced us to remember different shapes of sovereignty during wartime. This has been happening since 2014, but I would say especially since late 2022, civilian-military interaction has become pretty central to sustaining what remains of Ukrainian civilian resilience in the Russian-occupied territories. And I want to discuss how formal resistance doctrine, often very Western influence, that envisaged quite hierarchical stay-behind structures, essentially collapsed under conditions of total occupation, of surveillance and repression, and the model that emerged in its place, which is a much more decentralized sort of mode of cooperation. And in so looking at this, I want to look in particular at how sovereignty can and does survive without territorial control, but emphasizing that it does so only through trust, through the bond between civilians and the state, that keeps intelligence and therefore, to a certain extent, really now resistance alive under occupation. So in a way, I am talking about the democratization of intelligence that empowers people to defend this concept of sovereignty, but also how that same democratization very often also endangers these civilians and erodes the very trust on which that sovereignty depends. So what is resistance, or how am I defining it, perhaps? In this case, I'm defining it as the activity of Ukrainian civilians who've remained under occupation, who are knowingly and willingly acting out Ukraine's sovereignty over the territory, and in most cases, helping the armed forces of Ukraine to destroy their enemy, Russia, as effectively as possible. Some of the primary goals of the resistance, based on interviews with various resistance movements, are preservation of national identity, maintaining faith in future eventual liberation, maintaining the morale of the occupied communities, particularly through inevitability of punishment and retribution for occupiers and for collaborators, undermining the occupation administration, whether that's by discrediting them or by sabotage actions, information influence and counter-propaganda, and creating conditions for successful Ukrainian military operations. My notes will focus on intelligence-based resistance under occupation and some other forms, but not on recruitment strategy or defection efforts, though of course these matter too, but I'm interested in those who are knowingly and willingly and ideationally sort of part of networks. I suppose the first thing to mention is that from the outside it's often quite unclear who leads Ukraine's resistance. Ukraine does helpfully have a 2021 law on national resistance, which conceives Ruch Oporu, which literally means resistance movement, as coordinating civilian resistance as part of the special, of the SOF, of the Special Operations Forces. But since it does not have operational authority, i.e. it cannot run operations in the occupied territories, it perhaps inevitably became dependent on domestic security services, so SBU, and HUR, military intelligence, and of course the special forces themselves, which has led to duplication and confusion. At the same point, the NATO cell doctrine, which was encouraged for application in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, pretty much collapsed under surveillance and filtration, with both examples sort of drawing attention to a pretty sharp distinction between how structures are designed and how structures are lived, particularly in war. So that's an image as well taken from the BBC, just so people understand what are the territories that are currently occupied. In order to understand a little bit more about the resistance, let me talk very briefly just about some of the realities of occupation. Much of what's been written about the resistance has drawn on the lessons, for inevitable reasons, because it's easier to know about them, the lessons from Kharkiv region, from liberated Kharkiv region, which was liberated in 2022, and liberated Kherson region. However, their occupation is not particularly that representative of the type of occupation we see now in 2025, and arguably the type of occupation we've been seeing since certainly the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, particularly ideas around kind of local initiative, open defiance, and sort of partisan collaboration. I think many of those would be highly erroneous, if not, and indeed if not outright dangerous, when applied to the sort of deeper consolidated occupation that has followed in southern and eastern Ukraine from late 2022, but especially, as I said, post-counteroffensive. What's emerged since is a highly bureaucratized and securitized regime of total control, which has forced resistance to adapt accordingly. So I've listed here some of the kind of most obvious mechanisms of control, whether that's martial law, passportization, the demographic and ideological re-engineering, the use of social orphanhood to threaten people. So if you're a parent, if you do not send your child to various child militarization camps, child militarization sort of schools, you risk your child being deemed a social orphan and taken off you. So that's a pretty good way of controlling people's behaviour, parents' behaviour. Surveillance and communications control, such as SORM, which is an FSB program that essentially allows them to read all unencrypted messages, and even to look at quite a lot of metadata and other information relating to encrypted messages. Economic entrapment, the Centre for Occupation Studies, which also provided that picture that explains before the war, so this is the territory excluding Crimea, of the occupied territories, there were 9 million inhabitants, and now there's about 3.6, of which around 2 million are pensioners. So there's also been a huge demographic change that's also been influenced by massive settler colonialism inflows from various Central Asian countries and from Russia itself. Of course, there's violent repression and systemic impunity with at least 16,000 civilian detainees in some of the various 200 black sites, I suppose you could call them, illegal places of detention within the occupied territories, and many, many more prison systems inside the Russian Federation. There's also a huge narrative entrapment. So there's a wide range of fabricated channels, around 2,300 that have been created in Mariupol and Donetsk alone, centrally coordinated by the occupation administration, that push the idea of, Russia has always been here, Russia will be here forever, essentially silencing reality, including the fact that you haven't had water. So there's a huge water collapse within the occupied territories. You would not get that impression if you went on Telegram. So what the occupying forces are erasing is in many, many different aspects, I suppose, including dignity and the right to a very basic standard of living. But it's also focused on erasing Ukrainian identity as a supporting column of sovereignty. So understood here not just as territorial command, but also the lived relationship between the state and its citizens, part of which depends, of course, on a shared reality. How can you do resistance in these conditions? So if we take the classic model, violent versus non-violent, public versus private, we can roughly, but rather artificially, group today's resistance into 4 buckets, if you will. They're not fixed categories. Of course, people move between them, act in one while enabling another. And the vast majority of impactful resistance is now private, what I would describe as private and violent, so essentially intelligence gathering. Most of the people I've spoken to would estimate that around 90% of the resistance activity is occurring is gathering coordinates to say, where is the Russian base, where are the Russians' repair workshop, for example, for their vehicles, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, this intelligence gathering leads to strikes and violence, even if the person collecting the data never touches a weapon, which is what I define as violent. Public resistance, particularly non-violent forms, like graffiti or taking pictures of yourself saying Melitopol is Ukraine, they've become incredibly risky, and not to say pretty ineffective for any target audience. So symbolic acts still matter when they can be tied to, let's say, specific national holidays. But whereas this type of activity very much had a role in 2022, now the graffiti has to take place. There's so many cameras that graffiti has to be produced in places that are essentially completely inaccessible, so it goes unseen. Photos of small paper signs, they're ridiculed or dismissed as photoshops. And because of the widespread surveillance, such as the cameras and the internet monitoring, these actions very frequently lead to arrest. So even with blurred images, location, time frame can be identified. And the Russians, unfortunately, the FSB counterintelligence have the time and the resources and the intent to track these people down, which they very frequently do. As such, public nonviolent resistance is, except perhaps in certain very specific circumstances, is, I would argue, both pointless and dangerous in conditions of total occupation. Under surveillance, therefore, the violent resistance, non-violent resistance, to the extent that such a distinction could ever be really made without being artificially imposed by grant givers, collapses. Of most of the information, of course, does not become public. Around 20%, according to estimates, eventually becomes public information via reports, social media posts, statements. And it's important that some of it does become public because it shows, the situation is not under total control. And because it's important as well to show those who are providing coordinates that their information is having direct impact on the war effort. I want here actually to quote the founder of the Mariupol resistance, so Mariupolski Sprotiv or Mariupol Sprotiv, who's a bit more vociferous still even than I am about the collapse of any distinction and the kind of, I suppose, the falsehood of even talking about nonviolent resistance. So secondly, the very term nonviolent is utterly manipulative. In war, everything leads to violence one way or another. Acts of sabotage lead to repressive checks, etc. And then at the end, he asks an interesting question. We can pretend that resistance is separate from violence, but do we really have the luxury of self-deception? I don't think so, not during a war. Of course, suffice to say, there's incredible amounts of public violence. If I think about the last 10 days, for example, we've seen sabotage of railway lines, the burning of various military transport in Mariupol, the destruction of buchanki. How do I describe what a buchanka is? Essentially other forms of military transportation. Armoured transport with some electronic warfare around it. In Kherson, the use of IEDs in Tokmak, and assassinations at a watch-out point in Zaporizhia. So the resistance is still conducting these public, violent acts. And of course, a big focus has been the sabotage of logistics via railway lines. So we've talked a lot about some of the things. This is a picture from Mariupol port last month. We've talked quite a bit about some of the things that don't work. What has replaced it? So some of the reasons that the NATO cell, let's talk first about why the NATO cell didn't work, then we can talk a little bit about what replaced it. Some of the reasons for the failure of the NATO cell-based model was that first it was too vertical, so it allowed entire networks to be compromised, and it was rather easy to guess who would have been a member because they tended to be patriotic people in similar communities, often formed out of Euromaidan communities in 2014. Second was also not just a logistical failure, but what I would refer to as a sovereignty gap, a model that imagined command, not trust, as the states linked to civilians. Third, the caches that were prepared. They were based on conventional warfare needs, such as firearms, and they were essentially unusable under total surveillance. Many of them are still there. Hopefully one day they'll be usable. The absence of clear action protocols, over-reliance on vulnerable command structures, further exposed networks to collapse. In its place, it evolved a puzzle model, highly decentralized, anonymous structure where individual agents operate independently, guided by coordinators in Ukrainian-controlled areas, which minimizes the horizontal links, enhances survivability, and maintains operational continuity even if some parts of the isolated or siloized parts of the network are compromised. So sort of modular leadership and minimal command chains. In theory, rather than a sign of state weakness, I think in this case, decentralized resistance networks could be argued to represent, in very difficult circumstances, a recalibrated approach, fragmented in form but resilient in function. But it also reveals just as easily the frailty of informal networks and blurred lines between mobilization and sort of what we might call governance and a whole of society defense, because even with all of these different interesting conceptual approaches, in total occupation and isolation, human will still need digital tools. So human intelligence will still need digital tools to transmit safely. What methods are used? Well, there's a wide range, but most of the time it's Telegram. The general points I want to make, though, are that essentially if you have Signal, if you have certain apps are banned, if you have something like Signal or Element, well, if any of the checkpoints that you're going to have to pass through as a citizen of as a resident on the occupied territories, you are going to be sent to the basement, euphemism for being tortured. So you have to deal with very safe apps such as Telegram. And there are different ways to mitigate that risk. One of the issues that we often see is that whilst the decentralization of intelligence in the occupied territories is a necessary evil, that doesn't mean that, particularly from the Western, I would say, more than the Ukrainian side, that it shouldn't be run by professionals. Because where it hasn't been, and where it's been run for profit and by people without the contextual experience, that's where it's directly led to, bluntly, arrests, torture, death on the occupied territories, and in turn, beyond just the moral awfulness of that situation, you also have a huge undermining of the trust of that very sovereignty that the whole purpose of the resistance is there for keeping. So I won't have time to talk about the historical lessons, but just for the final takeaways. Decentralization does allow for survival, but it comes at a cost. Civilian death or arrest, distorted public understanding. Centralization isn't feasible, but there does need to be much more professionalization, because you need to build the trust-based systems that can protect those involved in providing the intelligence. Thank you.